In February 2022, the West launched the most comprehensive sanctions regime in history. Russia's central bank reserves were frozen, its largest banks were cut from SWIFT, exports were banned, imports were restricted, Western companies fled en masse. The goal was economic collapse, force Russia to withdraw from Ukraine through financial strangulation, cripple the economy, destabilize the regime. Experts predicted Russia's GDP would contract by 15%, that inflation would spiral out of control, that the ruble would become worthless, that within months economic pain would force a policy change. 3 years later, Russia's economy hasn't collapsed, the ruble stabilized, inflation moderated, GDP is growing, and the war continues. This isn't because the sanctions were weak, they were the strongest ever deployed. This is because economic warfare doesn't work the way textbooks predict, and Russia understood something the West forgot. In the real world, economics is subordinate to survival. Act 1. The weapon. The unprecedented scale. The sanctions against Russia weren't incremental, they were shock therapy. Within weeks of the invasion, the US and EU froze roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions. This was unprecedented. Central bank reserves are supposed to be untouchable, the ultimate safe asset. Freezing them sent a message: no Russian assets were safe. But it also sent a different message to every other country holding reserves in dollars and euros: your money isn't really yours. Russia's largest banks were expelled from SWIFT, the international payment messaging system. This was supposed to cripple Russia's ability to conduct international trade. Without SWIFT access, Russian banks couldn't coordinate payments with foreign counterparts. Western companies, thousands of them, announced withdrawals from Russia. McDonald's, Starbucks, Apple, IKEA, major manufacturers, retailers, and service providers abandoned operations representing decades of investment. Export controls targeted Russia's technology sector: semiconductors, aircraft parts, advanced machinery. Anything that could support military production or industrial capability was banned. And energy, Russia's primary export, faced restrictions. The EU pledged to phase out Russian oil and gas. The US banned Russian energy imports entirely. This was economic war, total, comprehensive, designed to collapse Russia's economy within months. The textbook logic. The theory was straightforward. Modern economies are interconnected. They depend on global trade, technology, and financial flows. Cut a country off from these flows, and its economy should spiral. Without access to advanced technology, industrial production falters. Without access to international payments, trade collapses. Without consumer goods, living standards decline. Without access to capital markets, investment stops. The population experiences rapid decline in quality of life. Inflation erodes savings. Shortages create panic. The middle class, usually the stabilizing force in society, turns against the government. Political pressure builds. Protests erupt. Elites who depend on Western access for their wealth start demanding policy changes. This is how sanctions are supposed to work. Economic pain translates into political pressure. Political pressure forces policy change. And historically, sanctions have sometimes worked this way. South Africa under apartheid, Iran over its nuclear program, North Korea to a limited extent. But Russia was different. Russia isn't a typical target for sanctions. It has several characteristics that make it unusually resilient. First, it's a commodity superpower. Russia produces oil, natural gas, wheat, fertilizer, metals, and other essential raw materials. The world needs these commodities, and commodities are fungible. They can be sold through intermediaries even when direct sales are blocked. Second, Russia is geographically massive and relatively self-sufficient in basic goods. It produces its own food. It has domestic manufacturing capacity, even if it's not cutting edge. It's not dependent on imports for survival. Third, Russia has experience with economic hardship. The 1990s were catastrophic. The 2008 financial crisis hit hard. The 2014 sanctions after Crimea's annexation forced adaptation. The population and government aren't strangers to economic pain. Fourth, Russia has a nuclear arsenal and permanent UN Security Council seat. It can't be invaded. It can't be regime changed militarily. Economic pressure is the only lever available, and Russia knows it. This meant sanctions had to work economically, or not at all. There was no credible military backstop, no credible threat of escalation beyond economic measures. Act 2. The adaptation. In the first weeks after sanctions, the ruble collapsed. It fell from roughly 75 rubles per dollar to over 120. Russian stocks plummeted. ATMs ran dry as citizens rushed to withdraw cash and convert to dollars. Western analysts declared victory. The economy was in freefall. Collapse was imminent. But then Russia responded, and the response revealed something important. When survival is at stake, governments can deploy tools that seem impossible under normal conditions. The Central Bank of Russia implemented capital controls. Russians couldn't move money out of the country couldn't convert rubles to foreign currency.
Above certain limits, foreign investors couldn't sell Russian assets and repatriate funds. These measures would normally destroy investor confidence, but Russia didn't care about investor confidence. It cared about stabilizing the currency. The Russian government mandated that energy buyers pay in rubles. If Europe wanted Russian gas, it had to acquire rubles to pay for it. This created artificial demand for the ruble. Interest rates were hiked to 20%. This made holding rubles more attractive and discouraged capital flight. Within months, the ruble recovered, not to pre-war levels, but to a stable range. The collapse was contained. Cutting Russia from SWIFT was supposed to cripple trade, but SWIFT is just a messaging system. If you can coordinate payments through alternative channels, trade continues. Russia pivoted. Transactions moved to corresponding banking relationships with non-Western banks, Chinese banks, Indian banks, Middle Eastern banks, Turkish banks. These intermediaries facilitated payments. The transactions became more expensive and slower, but they happened. Russia also increased use of its own payment system, SPFS, and China's CIPS. These systems aren't as comprehensive as SWIFT, but they work for bilateral trade. And for some transactions, parties simply used informal channels: cash, barter, cryptocurrency for small-scale deals, gray market intermediaries. The Western assumption was that excluding Russia from SWIFT meant excluding it from global trade. The reality was that SWIFT is one network among many, and when profits are high enough, alternative networks emerge quickly. Europe's pledge to phase out Russian energy was supposed to devastate Russia's economy. Energy exports accounted for roughly 40% of federal budget revenue. But energy is fungible, and global markets are integrated. Russia redirected oil and gas exports eastward. China and India dramatically increased imports of Russian energy at discounted prices, but still profitable prices. Europe, meanwhile, had to replace Russian supply. It bought LNG from the US and Qatar at premium prices. It bought oil from Middle Eastern producers. Some of that oil was Russian crude that had been refined or blended elsewhere and resold. The trade flows changed. The volume didn't decrease as expected, and the revenue Russia lost from discounted sales to Asia was partially offset by higher global energy prices caused by supply disruptions. By 2023, Russian energy export revenues had recovered to near pre-war levels despite European boycotts. The buyers changed. The money kept flowing. Western companies withdrew, and leaving a vacuum, Russian and Chinese firms filled it. McDonald's locations were rebranded as Vikusna i Tochka, tasty and that's it, and continued operating under new ownership. Same stores, same employees, different branding. Kia closed. Russian furniture companies expanded to serve the market. Chinese manufacturers increased exports. The withdrawals created short-term disruptions, but they also created opportunities for domestic producers and non-Western companies to capture market share. Russia's economy began what economists call import substitution. Domestic production increased in sectors previously dominated by imports. The quality was often lower, the efficiency worse, but functionality remained. Export controls on semiconductors and advanced technology were supposed to cripple Russia's military-industrial complex, but technology supply chains are porous. Semiconductors are small, valuable, and easily smuggled. Shell companies in third countries purchase chips and re-export them to Russia. China doesn't enforce Western export controls. Neither do many countries in Central Asia, the Middle East, or parts of Europe. Russia also increased domestic production of simpler technologies, not cutting edge, but sufficient for many applications, and it reverse-engineered or simply continued using older stockpiles of Western equipment. The military production that was supposed to grind to a halt continued. Slower, less efficient, but it continued. Drone production increased. Artillery shell manufacturing expanded. Russia adapted to technological constraints rather than being paralyzed by them. Now to think about the intended consequences. The Western sanctions regime required global cooperation to be effective, but much of the world didn't cooperate. China, India, and many developing nations refused to join sanctions, not because they supported Russia's invasion, but because they saw their own interests as separate from Western strategic goals. India bought Russian oil because it was cheap. This subsidized Indian economic growth. Why would India sacrifice its own development to enforce Western policy? China saw an opportunity to deepen ties with Russia and gain access to discounted commodities, and it saw the weaponization of the dollar and SWIFT as confirmation that it needed to build alternative systems. Many countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia abstained from UN votes condemning Russia, not out of love for Russia, but because they didn't want to be forced to choose sides in a conflict they saw as distant.
The sanctions revealed a fracture. The West assumed its economic power would automatically translate into global compliance. It didn't. The dollar weaponization concern. Freezing Russia's central bank reserves had an impact beyond Russia. It demonstrated that dollar reserves and Western financial assets can be confiscated if you displease Western governments. China noticed. Saudi Arabia noticed. Every country holding significant reserves in dollars noticed. If the U.S. can freeze Russian reserves, it can freeze anyone's reserves. The precedent was set, and countries started asking, are our reserves safe? This accelerated efforts to reduce dollar dependency. China expanded currency swap agreements. The use of renminbi in trade settlements increased. Discussions of alternative reserve currencies intensified. The irony is stark. The U.S. used its financial dominance as a weapon, and in doing so, gave every other country a reason to seek alternatives. This is a long-term cost. The sanctions might have hurt Russia in the short term, but they damaged the dollar's credibility as a safe reserve asset in the long term. The European economic pain. Sanctions hurt Russia, but they also hurt Europe. Europe depended on Russian gas for heating and industrial production. Replacing it required buying more expensive alternatives. Energy costs spiked, inflation surged, industrial competitiveness declined. Germany, Europe's industrial powerhouse, saw energy-intensive industries struggle. Chemical plants reduced production, steel mills faced shutdowns, manufacturers considered relocating. European consumers paid higher heating bills. Governments subsidized energy costs to prevent social unrest. These subsidies strained public budgets. The economic pain wasn't evenly distributed. The U.S., which doesn't depend on Russian energy, faced less disruption. Europe bore the cost of its own sanctions. This created political tension. Some European countries questioned whether the economic sacrifice was sustainable. Right-wing parties gained support by criticizing energy policies. The sanctions imposed real costs on the sanctioner, not just the target. The fragmentation of global systems. Pre-2022, the world was moving toward integrated economic systems. Supply chains were global, payment networks were universal, technology standards were largely harmonized. The sanctions accelerated fragmentation. Russia built parallel systems. China expanded its alternatives. Countries started hedging against exclusion from Western systems. SWIFT's dominance eroded slightly as alternatives gained legitimacy. The dollar's share of global reserves began a slow decline. Technology supply chains started bifurcating into Western and non-Western versions. This fragmentation is inefficient. Parallel systems are more expensive, less economically optimal, but they're politically safer for countries wary of Western sanctions. The long-term consequence is a less integrated global economy, more friction, higher costs, greater strategic competition. Sanctions achieved one goal clearly. They accelerated the end of the unipolar, Western-dominated global order. Act 4. Why survival beats economics. Western policymakers made a fundamental miscalculation. They assumed economic pain would translate automatically into policy change. This assumption works when the stakes are low. A country sanctioned over trade disputes might adjust policy to restore economic normalcy. But Russia views the war in Ukraine as existential. Whether that view is correct is debatable, but the Russian government believes it. And when survival is perceived to be at stake, economic costs become acceptable. No amount of economic pain will force a government to take an action it believes threatens its survival. The calculation shifts from how do we maximize prosperity to how do we endure. This is the difference between sanctions as economic pressure and sanctions in the context of existential conflict. The historical precedents. Britain during World War II endured devastating economic hardship, rationing, shortages, massive debt, but it didn't surrender because the alternative was perceived as worse. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in World War II. The economy was shattered, but it fought to victory because surrender meant annihilation. North Korea has endured decades of sanctions and economic isolation. Living standards are abysmal, but the regime survives because it prioritizes survival over prosperity. Cuba has been under U.S. sanctions for over 60 years. The economy is crippled, but the government persists. When governments frame issues as survival questions, they can endure economic pain that would seem impossible under normal conditions. Russia's government framed the Ukraine war as an existential threat. Whether that framing is accurate is separate from the fact that it makes economic sanctions less effective. The authoritarian advantage. Authoritarian governments have tools for managing public discontent that democracies don't. Russia controls media narratives. Opposition voices are silenced. Protests are crushed. The population doesn't have easy mechanisms to translate economic pain into political pressure. In a democracy, economic hardship leads to electoral consequences. Leaders face voters who can remove them. This creates incentives to avoid sustained economic pain. In an authoritarian system, that feedback mechanism is broken. Economic pain doesn't directly threaten the regime's hold on power unless it causes mass mobilization, and mass mobilization can be prevented through repression. This doesn't mean authoritarian governments are immune to sanctions, but it means the transmission mechanism from economic pain to policy change is less direct.
The mobilization effect. Sanctions can create a rally around the flag effect. External pressure unifies populations behind governments even when those governments are unpopular. Economic hardship caused by foreign sanctions is easier to tolerate than hardship caused by domestic policy failures. The enemy is external. The sacrifice feels patriotic. Russia's government framed sanctions as Western aggression, as proof that the West wants to subjugate Russia. This narrative resonates domestically, especially with older populations who remember the chaos of the 1990s, when Russia was weak and Western aligned. Sanctions, intended to divide the government from its population, sometimes achieve the opposite. They provide the government with an external enemy to blame for all domestic problems. Act 5. The real impact. The actual damage. This isn't to say sanctions had no effect. They did. Russia's economy is worse off than it would have been without sanctions. Growth is slower, living standards have stagnated, access to technology is constrained, long-term competitiveness has declined. Russian companies can't access Western capital markets. Foreign investment has collapsed. Brain drain accelerated as educated Russians leave. The military has access to fewer advanced weapons. Sanctions on components limit precision-guided munitions. The quality of military equipment has declined. These are real costs, just not the catastrophic collapse that was predicted. The long-term degradation. The true impact of sanctions may take years to manifest. Economies don't collapse overnight. They degrade gradually. Russia's inability to import advanced technology means its industrial base becomes obsolete over time. Equipment that can't be replaced wears out. Knowledge that requires interaction with global cutting-edge developments becomes outdated. The population's human capital erodes. The best and brightest leave. Universities can't collaborate with international peers. Scientific advancement slows. These effects accumulate. In 10 or 20 years, Russia may find itself significantly behind technologically and economically. But that's a long-term consequence. In the short to medium term, Russia adapted enough to sustain the war effort. The lesson for future conflicts. The Russian experience teaches several lessons about sanctions. First, sanctions work best as part of a broader strategy. Alone, they rarely force policy change in existential conflicts. Second, sanctioning commodity exporters is difficult. As long as buyers exist somewhere in the world, trade continues. Third, authoritarian regimes can endure economic pain that would topple democracies. Fourth, weaponizing financial systems has long-term costs. It accelerates the search for alternatives and fragments the global economy. Fifth, sanctions impose costs on the sanctioner. If those costs aren't sustainable, the sanctions regime will erode. The uncomfortable reality. The West hoped sanctions would be a decisive weapon, a way to force Russia's hand without military confrontation. They weren't. They're a tool, a constraint. They make Russia's war effort harder, more expensive, less sustainable long-term. But they didn't stop it, and they won't stop it unless combined with other forms of pressure or Russia's own internal dynamics change. This is the uncomfortable reality. Economic power, even overwhelming economic power, has limits. It can't substitute for military power. It can't override survival imperatives. It can't force governments to take actions they view as existential threats. Understanding this doesn't mean sanctions were pointless. It means expectations need to be recalibrated. Sanctions are a constraint, not a solution. Russia's sanctions didn't work as hoped because the West misunderstood the nature of the conflict. Economic pain matters when governments care more about prosperity than policy, when the stakes are negotiable, when alternatives exist. But when governments frame conflicts as existential, economics becomes subordinate to survival, and survival calculations don't follow economic logic. Russia adapted. It found workarounds. It accepted costs. It endured. This doesn't mean Russia won. The economic damage is real and cumulative. But it does mean sanctions alone couldn't achieve their stated goal, forcing Russian withdrawal through economic strangulation. Understanding this isn't about defending Russia's actions. It's about recognizing the limits of economic power, about seeing that tools don't work the same way in every context, that assumptions about how countries should behave often don't match how they actually do. The Western policy consensus assumed economics would override politics. History suggests otherwise. When survival is at stake, or believed to be, nations endure almost anything. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.